Oh, good afternoon, everybody. I don't know whether it's best to be on just before lunch or just after, but stick with me. I'm only going to be 15 minutes. Just to say, unlike everybody else, I've not spent very much time in prison. I have had the unfortunate responsibility of spending some time in prison interviewing those who have offended against children, but I'm glad to say it hasn't been a huge part of what I've had to do over the years. Just to perhaps put you in the picture as to who CCPAS are before I go any further, in case you haven't heard of us. We are the first and only independent, non-denominational Christian safeguarding charity in the UK, established in 1977. And it is our pleasure and privilege to work across the Christian community and also outside of that with those of other faiths increasingly. And with local and national government advising on issues where faith and potentially Christianity more particularly affects the safeguarding task. So it is a great opportunity to be involved in that work, and thank you very much to Donald and the Lucy Faithfull Foundation for the opportunity to speak this afternoon. I'm just going to take you really quickly through a recent study that I conducted and concluded earlier this year, which ties in and speaks to very nicely, I think, the themes that we've been picking up this morning already around situational prevention measures and the breadth of what that might mean. The study that I undertook was a small-scale study, so please do bear that in mind and be aware that clearly there are limitations, therefore, in relation to some of the conclusions that are being drawn here. But it was about safeguarding and safer recruitment within the Christian church context. Now, I appreciate I've been given a brief to speak about faith communities. Now, what I would say is that I don't imagine that there is much that I will say in the next 15 minutes that doesn't apply to a range of other communities, a range of other faith communities. So forgive me, I will carry on that basis. Just for those of you who aren't aware of what we mean by safer recruitment, it is probably, almost undoubtedly, more than what it suggests on the tin. As this slide shows, we've actually got a series of measures that can be operated within an organisational context that sit within a broader context of safer workforce management. So, specifically in relation to safer recruitment, we are trying to deter, reject, prevent, detect unsuitable individuals, and there are a range of things that we might be doing, such as putting together clear job descriptions, person specs, adverts, stating our commitment to safeguarding, application forms, all of that. But what I should say right at the outset here is that this isn't everything that we must be doing. We must be very clear to be aware of what risks there are that are apparent in any given context and environment, as we've been learning all morning, and that the safer recruitment part of things is only an element of the things that we can be doing. So just to kind of give you a whistle-stop tour then of what we had with this study, and perhaps just kind of reflecting on what Sue Borelowicz said this morning, there is still a significant level of disbelief in certain communities, possibly even across society in general, that actually child abuse happens in the way that it does. Now, CCPAS has been working for 25 plus years to try and educate, to equip, to empower those who are working in church and other faith-based communities to kind of address this unthinkable issue. And we are still doing it. There is still a need for us to be doing that. So when Sue mentioned that this morning, I was really quite pleased. And the reason why organisations such as the one I work for are still needed is because there is still this level of disbelief, indifference, naivety perhaps. But the aims of the study were twofold, and they were to look at the extent of safer recruitment practice within the Christian church, how it was understood, how it was implemented to safeguard children and young people. So, as we've already heard, not wanting to put an exclusive focus upon offenders, but actually put children and young people at the centre of what we were trying to understand. And to what extent was that understanding informed by guidance, policy, legislation, etc., about offenders, their behaviours, about the risks that are apparent in any given situation, and therefore what the necessary management measures were. So those are the two things that the study attempted to identify. So just kind of coming from that point of view that yes, child abuse does happen within the church, child abuse does happen within other faith communities. Perhaps I should kind of stop here and say there's been an awful lot of focus perhaps on abuse within church that might lead us to believe that the people who are the greatest risk to our children and young people are clergy. Because we have all this kind of hype and high media profile about clergy perpetrated sexual abuse, whether it be the Church of England or whether it be the Roman Catholic Church. But let me just say, we work across the church spectrum and with other faiths, as I've already said. And I don't believe that there is any bigger an issue in the Roman Catholic Church or the Church of England than there is in any other section of the faith community in this country. So we work across all, we see the same issues, whatever manifestation the church happens to take. So let's just kind of be mindful of that. I think the Church of England, the Roman Catholic Church are easy to target. They're perhaps much more easy to identify, but there are many, many more churches that are kind of within this context. So we'll come back to those in a moment. What we have discovered, what we do know, is that the church, faith community at large, is very diverse in how it looks, its beliefs, its doctrines, practices, structures. But what we have also discovered is that it is, church particularly, the largest employer of children and young people's workers in this country. Is that a surprise? I guess for many of you it may well be. Without wanting to get political, what we've seen is slashed budgets from central down to local government. We've seen services such as our youth services taking a real hammering. And who is it generally who's stepping into the gap to provide those services and supports? Well, invariably within your community it's likely to be your church, it's likely to be other faith groups, other community groups. But the church has become one of the key players in this space. And again, without wanting to get too political, I often find myself saying, I really, really wish that our government, whatever shape it takes, would recognise the contribution that the faith community brings to promoting the welfare of children and also to protecting them from harm and abuse, because they play a critical role in that task. So the sample, I'm not going to go into great detail about the methodology behind this, because actually it was fairly straightforward, but we've not got much time anyway. You'll see from this graph that actually there is no representation from the Church of England. There is no representation from the Roman Catholic Church. And for those of you who know your onions, you'll know that there are probably other key players who are missing also. So as it happens, these are the churches and the denominations that responded to this particular study. And although initially I was quite disappointed about that, I came to think actually this has been quite helpful, because what it will start to do is enable us to get a better picture of what church looks like anyway. And the fact that we're not just talking about the Church of England, we're not just talking about the Roman Catholic Church. So these are broadly what we would describe as the free church. And they would broadly have far less structure. They'd have less accountability, possibly. Different levels of independence, which can present some particular challenges, and we have found do in fact present some particular challenges in the task of safeguarding children. In terms of the numbers of workers across these churches that responded, well, we had a combination of both paid and voluntary workers. And what we need to bear in mind here is that the church and faith groups particularly will largely be made up of a volunteer workforce. There may well be a small number of paid staff involved, as this study suggested, but more often than not it's about a fairly large, flexible and sometimes transient volunteer workforce, and that in itself presents some challenges to the context. So in terms of what I will say perhaps about the methodology, a purposive sample taken from the CCPAS database, which carries, depending on which section of it you look at, between 6,000 and 15,000 contacts. But the purpose of sample here was safeguarding coordinators. So the churches that we'd made contact with needed to have a designated safeguarding person responsible for a range of tasks within the church, and it was either that person or somebody who had specific management or supervisory responsibility for workers engaged in children or youth work in that church. So that is what we got. And we undertook a range of semi-structured interviews to gain the detail. Now, I'm just going to jump really quickly to some headline findings. We had 9 key themes that came out of this piece of work. But what we discovered was significant variations in understanding and practice. So we got some great examples of good practice in relation to safer recruitment and workforce management, understanding of the issues, the risks, and what the situation had to hold in terms of risks. But there was not always consistent application, in fact very rarely any consistent application in the understanding and the processes that followed. One of the key things was that what we discovered, because we were looking at both understanding and then implementation, that there was a disconnect between those two things. So we discovered that most of these churches were undertaking some and a few all of what we might see as a comprehensive, robust, safer recruitment process, but most of them, in fact, were not able to articulate why they did what they did. They weren't able to articulate clearly the fact that we see risks looking like this within our particular context, and therefore we do things in this particular way. So things like safer working practices, the things that reduce the likelihood of harm coming to children, weren't always translated well into the processes that followed. So challenges, a huge number of them really. I've just picked out a few. Largely volunteer workforce, as I've mentioned already, and because of that there is a highly trusting relationship often. Workers are friends, are family, and that presents a range of issues in terms of managing boundaries, expectations and potential risk. Access to training has been historically very poor, and that grieves me to say, having been involved with Donald and others in relation to developing safer recruitment training and guidance. It hasn't hit the Christian church as well as it might have done, and I would imagine it perhaps hasn't hit the faith community as well as it might have done. The public perception of risk and the fact that it is clergy that we need to be most afraid of when it comes to abuse of children, I think is hampering and giving us a skewed view of the reality that is faced in many churches. And we've got this clear issue of processes not always being set on firm foundations. So what are the potential solutions? Well, there are many. Thank you. Improved communication at a high level, supporting safer recruitment. To break some of the myths and the misperceptions, I think it was yourself, Donald, Finlater and Fison, who mentioned about the misperception and the myth around child abuse and how it's understood. We need to continue to break some of that down for churches. Provision of safer recruitment training aimed at churches and places of worship that is specific for them, addressing some of the unique challenges that do exist within those situations and contexts. And the creation and dissemination of improved guidance for them. There are some denominations that will already do that to a greater or lesser degree, but we need to get much better at singing from the same song sheet, to coin a popular phrase, but to get consistent messages out about what we're trying to do. So just in conclusion, if the church is to become a safer place that is required for children, it must ensure that it's able to facilitate a genuine commitment to achieving this through a variety of measures and safeguarding arrangements. Amongst these, but not limited to, is safer recruitment processes. And that has been a particular hobby horse of mine for a few years, and will continue to be, because I do believe it has a critical role to play. We are working from a particularly low baseline, I have to say. So a lot of the stuff that we've heard this morning, in a sense, is alien language to a lot of the communities that we work in. But we need to keep plugging away, nonetheless. Thank you very much.